Welcome to our fourth episode on shaping portfolio agility. In the last three episodes, we covered what is a portfolio anyway and what makes it lean. And then we took this really interesting segue out into strategy, which at least was interesting for Mark and I, and hopefully for everybody listening. And now we're coming back and we're kind of asking ourselves, so what? As we take everything we've covered to date and we start to really dive into portfolio design and evolution. And in today's episode, we'll start out explicitly answering that question. What is that so what a strategy? Why does that matter so much to portfolio design? And then we'll use that as a bridge into making sense of how portfolios evolve and change over time, what characteristics are important, what questions you should be asking yourself, and what's your role if you don't happen to be an executive around one of these portfolios? If you're in that coaching role or that portfolio management role, what kind of influence should you have over the shape and design of a portfolio? So as we dive into this episode, Mark, do you want to kick us off talking about the role of a portfolio in the ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eric. And, there's been a number of themes that have emerged for us as we've explored the topic. They've hopefully emerged a little bit for you in the first few podcast episodes. But, this concept of the fact that I have a portfolio and I have an ecosystem of portfolios. And, if we begin lean by understanding what we've got, then I need to start to understand, well, what does the ecosystem look like? This portfolio, what is its job to do in the ecosystem? Where does it fit? Who are its neighbors? What are its connections? And, normally when we talk about lean portfolio management, we say one of the critical things your portfolio is doing is providing context to the people within the portfolio. But it's very difficult to give context to the people within unless you understand the context portfolios within. And so you've got this notion of, why does the portfolio exist, which you can really only understand by understanding the ecosystem that it lives inside. So this notion of clarity of where a portfolio is focused. Did you want to add a little bit to that one, Eric?
Yeah, I think that's a good one to pick up on. The thing that is always important to me when I think about this is, does the portfolio know its own job? We spent a lot of time talking about the jobs of a portfolio in the second episode. And I've spent a lot of time over the last probably 5 years. I've been talking about purpose, and talked about it under the guise of strategy deployment. I've talked about it under the guise of purpose deployment, safe, hidden purpose hierarchy. But all of it really comes down to know why you exist as a portfolio, as Mark said, the context you live within, so that you have something that starts to guide your change and shape where you're headed. And you spent a lot of time talking about lean as like start where you are. And now we're going to talk about and then what? And we had a really interesting back and forth as we were getting into this because we had this language of, well, you've got a portfolio and there's this portfolio you need. But that word need caused all sorts of fun hassles because, like, need according to who? Need according to what? What do we even mean by need? Is it what we can see from where we are? Is it what this idealistic, perfect, agile portfolio that every coach will like go, wow, that's amazing? What do we mean by need? So we had to like start to put some incremental steps in there. And we Mark, maybe you can shed some light on this, the back and forth we had as we tried to navigate to like find that middle language.
Look, I think the beginning of the back and the forth was your passion for transformative portfolios.
True.
And, no doubt we'll talk about that again a little bit later in this episode. But you have been lucky enough to work with a lot of transformative portfolios where you are in a position where you're establishing portfolio to bring about a transformative change in the company's capability or their business operations and product offerings. And yet our general thread, and this has been my life, is you're starting with the portfolio you've got. And there's a temptation when you look at some of the tools, and it was certainly a temptation for me when I read Zone to Win and started to experiment with it, which is to say, this is the moment where I zoom back out and I completely redesign the enterprise's portfolio ecosystem. But part of what I have done, and literally the first two times I used it in anger, was I sat down and I think I mentioned on a previous episode, both times I sat down with the CFO and it was an early discussion about lean portfolio management. We talked a little bit about investment zones and horizons. And then we went through an exercise and we went, okay, well, let's look at our company. And if we use the zone to win model, what would our portfolios look like? A- And, it was an interesting conceptual exercise, at which point generally you look at it and go, that is very, very different. But what it then led to was, a series of really interesting questions where we said, well, if this is what we've got, and that's what looks pretty convincing in terms of what we would have if we'd used Zone to Win to design them. What new questions do we ask ourselves about what we've got that are going to start to lead us towards some of the opportunities we would have if we were working on a blank canvas? And one of those instant opportunities was starting to think about OKRs. And, Safe started talking about OKRs for strategic themes in portfolios back in 2019. I remember it very distinctly because I had a entire talk about how to use OKRs with Safe for the Safe Summit. Safe had never talked about them before, and 3 weeks before the summit, they published a new article saying, "Hey, OKRs would be a great thing for strategic themes." And I suddenly had to go back and look at my final deck and go, "Ah, how does what I say match up with what they say?" But they're a very popular tool, whether or not you use Safe these days. Portfolio is a great place for them.
Mhm.
And so one of the questions is, well, if I can understand my context a little bit better, how does that influence my choice of OKRs? Um, did you want to add anything on the OKR topic, Eric?
I think we'll hit it a lot more in the next episode as we talk about each of the different example types of portfolios. I think the types of OKRs really bubble up there, but maybe just a quick comment. Regardless of your portfolio, you're working towards something. So you will have OKRs, you will have a strategy that's in play, even if we're talking about the strategy types from the earlier episodes that it's not exactly clear what the bigger strategy is you're working towards. Inside the portfolio, you can still come up with OKRs that are relevant to the people in it, regardless of the strategic context.
So, if that's an example of a new question you might ask yourself, right? I've looked at the way my portfolios exist, my current ecosystem. I've perhaps looked through the lens of a different model and said, what might it be if I had a blank slate? The way I shape my OKRs could change because of that contextual understanding. And that's the first of many, many insights I might see. Right? Another classic insight is when I look at a set of portfolios side by side, are there gaps? Right? Is something falling through the cracks between the portfolio? Are there overlaps, potential duplication? Uh, are there things missing? Right? We know in the performance zone in Zone to Win that shapes this concept of bringing together the BU and the channel in shared accountability for strategic outcomes. When I look at my portfolios, do I actually see the voices in the portfolio representative of that? And so it's this whole bunch of questions. But the other piece of that puzzle, and to be honest, again, as we are just kind of warming up this morning before we hit the record button, I was like, well, this episode and the next episode. So far, most of our discussion has actually been understanding the whole. But the truth is, starting where you are, the biggest thing you're likely to be able to influence is the portfolio you're looking at. And so what we're going to do in this episode is to zoom in a little bit to the portfolio you're looking at and say, you know, what are the first wave of things and questions you're going to ask yourself inside the portfolio uh, before next episode we zoom back out and probably dig a little bit deeper into the ecosystem implications. So I might hand back to Eric inside the portfolio.
Yeah, so this was kind of the other half of the so what that we wanted to answer around the strategy. It's like if you're inside a portfolio, if you're an executive who's responsible for delivery within a portfolio, but you're not really shaping that ecosystem. Why does it matter? What's the so what of having all this clarity around the strategy and where you fit in the zone to win and all that stuff? And we really wanted to spend a little time here because sometimes it's not clear why it is so dang important to have that clarity. And there's two kind of top level things we're not very good at separating. I think we tend to blur these together when we talk. But one is by clarifying that strategy, you can then cascade and clarify your internal strategy. And as you're designing your value streams, your teams, your trains, whatever you use to shape the inside of your portfolio, being able to marry those up back to the original strategy and make sure there's no material gaps as you try to pursue this overall OKRs and making sure that you're frankly meeting the intent, doing the job you're paid for as a portfolio as a whole. So that clarifying that internal strategy becomes the first area. And then the second starts to dig into kind of putting a context around the governance, the operational approaches you'll choose. And we'll maybe come back to that word choose in a couple minutes. But as I think about clarifying strategy, Mark, is there stories you want to tell or anything you want to add around the implications there?
This is almost my favorite early discussion. If I'm in a early what is lean portfolio management, what do you care about discussion with a group of executives. The first job for me of the portfolio is to establish a clear line of sight between your strategy, the work you're doing, the money you're spending, and enable you to start to have conversations in terms of that clear line of sight. And so, generally the first exercise I do is to say, well, show me your strategy deck, right? What are you showing the board? What are you showing your stakeholders? Um, what's your declared strategy? And then show me your book of work. And let's start to draw connection lines between what's happening in your book of work and what's happening in your strategy. And it usually creates a very awkward conversation. The first conversation is, that's really hard. It's going to take us a while, which has already told you an interesting thing. And then you go away and you build it, and generally you get back a piece of spaghetti. So we know that strategy should unfold. We chatted about that quite a bit last episode, a little bit the episode before. And there's a piece where when you're in the ecosystem, your portfolio design should really be a logical unfolding of strategy with different portfolios taking ownership of different pieces. Once you're inside the portfolio, what are the tools you're using to go, I'm going to unpack the next layer of my strategy, right? So that I can have the right conversations in the portfolio. And then so that also as I go down towards my execution engines, be they value streams or arts or other beasts, they can understand where they fit into the strategy components that the portfolio is responsible for. So we want to start to build this thread, and generally our first efforts go, that's really difficult. And obviously there are some tools that might help in that. But when it comes to making sense of the mess, uh, that's probably not so much a strategy discussion quite often as a standards and processes discussion. So I might throw the ball back to you, Eric.
And I think that's where I actually struggle with when people make it too much about those other things. Because when I look at operations, and I'm going to hold off on governance for a second, maybe dig into operations in this. It's surprising, actually. No, I'm not going to hold off on governance. It's surprising on both how rarely people try to connect any of that back to their strategy and their context. And yet, if I look at this is a kind of a real story. Um, one of the products I was supporting was very much all about this growth and looking customer acquisition. They're having all these grand stories, and I'm like, well, you're operating as part of a value portfolio. Your job is to deliver the highest margin as we retire this product. Um, doesn't that change how you behave and how you work with customers a little bit? Change the nature of the decisions you're making and how you choose and partition your investments? And as you're governing this, shouldn't we be looking at how we reduce the cost and maybe shifting to more of a low cost supplier approach instead of a boutique supplier approach. And like it was fascinating watching these leaders go, oh, wow, we got so excited by product management, we forgot what we were selling. And yet, where you are in a portfolio context changes that. The nature of your relationship with your customers and how you operate the delivery of your internal services is wildly different if you're a platform versus if you're a direct line of business. If you're in the productivity zone, the way you're in service changes, and as a result, kind of the things you value and the way you structure the governance and the steering of the management of the investments as opposed to the strategy element of them. Like a lot of stuff starts to shift connected to store or connected to your strategy, and it should show up in your governance and operational approaches. And I see that gap too often, and it becomes a constraint. It becomes a blocker to evolving either your strategy or your portfolio design. Um, so that's a huge so up for me when it comes to governance and operational space around strategy. Um, but I think we could do ourselves a disservice if we went too deep on this topic right now, and it might be worth moving up and starting to look at a little bit more of a sense making topic and some of the techniques we use to make sense of things. Mark, you want to jump back in on this?
I'd love to. So, of course, the buzzword is visualize, visualize, visualize. We know lean leans heavily into visual management. And if I rolled the clock back, what, 12 years now to when I started with the whole idea of lean portfolio management, the first thing that I wanted to do was build a portfolio Kanban. And I would call a session of portfolio execs and PMO people. And I would say, let's build with post-its a view of how work flows through your system. And I didn't want to start with a here's what the textbook says. I wanted to start with show me your workflow process. Um, and then let's visualize that as a Kanban and let's start to create some new conversations. Uh, and and I sat in that for a lot of years, but then I found I got a bit stuck. Uh, Biggest reason I got stuck is because a Kanban's great when it changes regularly, but quite often those portfolio Kanbans don't change very regularly.
Hmm.
There's big beasts in them. They're pretty slow moving. And so I started to look at other visualization patterns. And, you know, if you really sit at it, you've got to think the two levels. We talk about it again and again and again. Visualize your role in the ecosystem, right?
Yep.
Particularly know what's on your edges, know your key interactions. Um, Visualize the information flow, right? And this is probably dipping a little bit between strategy and operations, but generally there is some kind of enterprise cycle of steering operations, strategy, and governance events, of course, the king of which is the fiscal year. Um, and you want to think about how information flows between those events and across layers. Um, you want to visualize your book of work and how that relates to your strategy and start to build what's usually a very, very messy picture of the world you've got into a single piece. And it's amazing how often, and once upon a time, I used to take over rooms and say, right, we're just going to make this the room that visualizes our portfolio. Uh,
Yep.
these days, of course, it's a Miro, uh, and you get this massive sprawling Miro. But then you can start to really drive some fresh discussion. So, digging a little bit deeper into that thread, why are we visualizing? We're visualizing because we want to see opportunity, right? Spark a new conversation, spark a new insight. And I know you love to geek out on visualization and sparking conversations too. So I want to throw back to you.
Talking about this, and I, ironically, given that I was a Kanban guy for so long, I didn't actually start with building the Kanban at the portfolio level. I always started by building, I guess, what I would call the splat graph. Um, and it was find the image of the enterprise architecture that was relevant for this portfolio. So whatever the let's just say the right level of abstraction, because that changes depending on your scale. And then take the really big things in the book of work and go splat and see what they light up. Okay, this project is going to hit these 12 things. This program is going to mostly be down here. Oh, this one is just a layer across the front end. And I start to picture these overlays. And that was my portfolio visualization. It showed me where all the interdependencies were. And too often, yeah, it was splat. Like, especially if you did both the org chart and and my org chart, I mean how the teams and trains or whatever, not just the reporting hierarchy,
Yep,
but the org chart and the application graph or the enterprise architecture map.
yep.
Um, and that really, more than anything else, would viscerally tell executives where they're starting. This is where you are. You want to get this done? You're touching all these things and all these people. What questions do you have? And usually it's like, well, what do we do about it? It made it a lot easier.
Which is
But
so
that's
go.
the big part of knowing. That's the big part of knowing where you are, is having that moment of, okay, we're here. I don't know if we love it or not, but we're here. So now what?
So generally at this point, when you're built, and I love the splat graph, I think I'm going to steal that one. But once you've got that, there's a moment of temptation where you go, "Oh my goodness, we've got to change the world," and then there's a moment of reality check, right? And the reality check is so much of what you can shift in a portfolio is driven by your fiscal cycle, right? Wherever we are in any given year, you've got a reality that says you're currently executing on a funded book of work that was created last fiscal year. And it's pretty difficult to change anything material about that. And a lot of things will trace back to the way you've constructed your funding approach and your book of work. But what you're also probably doing is shaping next year's. And, if you're a standard company in Australia, fiscal year turns over in end of June. If you're a bank, fiscal year turns over at the end of September. Um, and actually, I was just having breakfast earlier this week with a former client who looks after the portfolio for a big bank. And we're in end of February, and he's busy composing his investment slate for next fin year to start the cycle that will end at the end of September. And so the kind of first rule of thinking about the change that you're going to begin to act on is there's change I can make today, which to be honest is generally governance and operations change. And there's change I can start to prepare for because maybe I can start to think about different ways in which I might begin to compose next year's investment slate.
One of the things I see people do in this case, and I don't know how much you see but they're, instead of looking for the path to that patience and the kind of the acceptance and the let's start the meaningful change process, recognizing it's 18, 36 months horizon for some of this stuff, they go to look for the person that can say yes. And it's like, well, we don't want to wait. Let's go find the person who can change all of this. And I was that person for a long time, not the person who could say yes, but the person that went looking for them. And it took me a while to realize that if you're, especially if you're in a publicly traded company, there's nobody that can say yes. There literally is no single or group of people in the company that can change things in a meaningful way this financial year, because commitments have already been made to the street. The CEO can say, I would love to change this. We're going to start to evolve our portfolios. And next year we can make some changes. And the year after that, we can introduce a new business unit. Wait, what? And it's like, but yeah, that with unless it's a major transformative growth experience, you don't get to mess with your existing books of business and existing business units, because the street makes valuations based on that, and that changes your cost of lending and everything else. Like a house of cards can collapse if you start to mess with that too hard. So I think a lot of the pushing I've done over the years runs into that, and I think a lot of credibility can be lost if you try to ignore those realities, because to the people in those positions, that is their reality. That's where they spend most of their time, energy, and stress.
I think if I double down on that, Because I was also that person. Just if I talk to somebody senior enough, the world can change. Um, and then, of course, I learned similar lessons to you. But I think the other piece of that puzzle is not just that aspect, but can you change safely?
Yeah.
Right? We're generally, if it's an enterprise, we're talking about hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And if you want to make fundamental change, you've got to prove that it's safe to change. That as you potentially impose some radical new thinking, you've got the appropriate controls in place. And actually, I was talking to a client last year who'd gone down the path of saying they'd engaged group risk and they had defined a risk based approach to enabling portfolio evolution, where they defined a set of key risks that a portfolio was responsible for managing. Uh, and, perhaps it's the risk that we will overspend or underspend, or the risk that we will under realized benefits or over realized benefits. And their challenge to their portfolios was to say, demonstrate that you've got the appropriate controls in place for this risk, and you can generate a change to the way you operate on the basis that you can demonstrate you've got an appropriate control in place. So,
Nice.
it's a long, slow burn move, um, which shouldn't dampen your enthusiasm for chasing the dream that might be 3 or 4 or 5 years away. That you get to a step at a time, and you're really looking to generate proof points as you go.
Interesting model. I like that one.
I thought it was fascinating. Dealt particularly well with hybrid.
So if you're not making these big changes, then how do you use all these ideas we've been talking about? Where do we start?
Well, we know we start where we are, right? And I think for me, there's always two lenses. There's a lens which says, how can I make more clear the link between operations and governance and strategy and start to shift conversations to happen in that context? And then probably an awful lot of the work is how does operations and governance need to change to sustainably do that? And maybe one last thing, and this is my cheeky coach bit. Right. The cheeky coach bit is there are things I can see that probably need to happen that the broader organization might not be able to. And I start to think, what kind of metrics, measures, or visualizations might I put in place that are going to start to bring those new questions to light? Uh,
Yeah, I was talking. Great example. I was talking to the head of an EPMO small company, and just this last week they found the opportunity to facilitate was essentially a portfolio sync or a trade-off conversation. But was that managed to engineer the first time the collective heads of the business had to viscerally confront the fact that they weren't going to get anything near what they think they wanted to get unless they were willing to essentially double their technology spend. And then I think that's a classic example of creating the visualization in a deeply uncomfortable moment, but one backed by data and clarity that put options on the table. It didn't like confront and rub their noses in the fact they're going to fail. It's, hey, here's the realities. Here's your three paths. Now you're in this forum. Start to make these choices. And it's hard to be in that moment. And I have empathy for those business leaders. But fundamentally, this is the opportunity to deploy some strategy. You're making hard choices.
Big time. Got any other examples in your head? First starting places.
Um, well, one is to just look at, and this is perhaps where the portfolio Kanban does come back into my mind a little bit, is I start to look at this transition of formulating strategy to articulating strategy and then deploying it. And being more intentional, especially in the middle of that, starts to emerge a lot of opportunities. So one of the visualizations that I think a lot of people think visualization's a report or a graph or a diagram. But one of the things I think of as also is just found clarity. And bringing clarity to the real intention behind some of these larger strategic investments, not the OKRs or the pithy epic template or anything like that, or even the background, but bringing the story out and the meaning and the intention behind it. That narrative often opens up a lot of opportunities to cut corners on extra stuff and free up some capacity, and make some interesting moves to get much more out of your spend. And those ideas originate for much further down in the portfolio than you might expect. I've watched that happen probably dozens of times at this point when you start to story tell your strategy a little bit.
You just reminded me of my favorite new toy I invented last year.
Oh,
Uh,
that'll be fun.
so, you know, we know epics, and we haven't talked much about the book of work. And actually, we're not going to talk too much about the book of work until we're pretty deep into the podcast. But if the epic is your big kind of strategic investment vehicle that flows through the portfolio, or you'd like it to flow through the portfolio, and you think about what should an epic be, it should tell a story you're just talking about. And when you start to explicitly go, what is our life cycle and what do we know? What do we want to know in the life cycle? We want to know drivers, we want to see leading indicators, so on and so forth. And you actually look at the piece of your book of work through that lens. What you generally find is you got a whole bunch of in-flight stuff that doesn't tell any of the story you'd like it to tell. And and that in itself can be really overwhelming because you're looking, how much work is it going to be to clean all of that up? And I was working with a portfolio last year. We were in exactly that place. And, they had probably 20 in-flight epics, missing an awful lot of the what should have been there. And I could see their faces and I went, you know what? We can't fix all of this straight away. Let's do a sniff test. And so we designed this little sniff test template, which was basically we should have clarity about customers, the problem it's solving, the benefits, uh, and there was a list of kind of 7 or 8 things, absolutely through a desirability, viability, and feasibility and sustainability lens. And I went, let's just run this sniff test over all the epics that we've got anywhere in life cycle. And all I want you to do is go, how smelly is it through each of those lenses? And we actually tacked this onto the epics.
I'm
And
picturing scratch and sniff.
it nearly was, right? And so we wound up with this, portfolio Kanban with all the epics having a sniff test stuck on them. And then the question we asked ourselves was, how can we make them a little bit less smelly? Which
I
one's
like
the
that.
smelliest? Where are we going to start to shift first? So, if you take this concept, it's there's a natural desire to go, I want a recipe. There are no recipes, but boy, there are a lot of easy starting tools to create new conversations. And I can see you itching to go, here's my favorite, or what's next.
It's actually working to take that exact segue you just took. So I'll just pick up on that and run with it. Um, no recipe. You can probably tell from the conversation we've got lots of stories and lots of examples. There's a pile of tools out there in the practices, but not really any strict one, two, three. Now, that said, there are some places that by putting a little energy early, you tend to get better results. And there's a handful of characteristics of a portfolio that are, in my experience, worth visualizing and paying attention to early because they start to emerge and help you ask the questions that drive the kinds of things we just talked about. We actually took the opportunity when we were working on the portfolio article last year to frame some of it in these terms. And it's in terms of purpose, context, and structure. And we've spent a lot of time talking about purpose. Why does this portfolio exist? Um, what is it meant to achieve in the enterprise from a strategic point of view and from a contribution to the services and the landscape and the ecosystem point of view? And kind of if you look at it from the outside, what's expected of it is the way I think of it. And then we dig into context. I don't want to spend too much more time on purpose, I think, at this point. But context starts to get interesting because that's all about the influences and the constraints and the nuance of the political landscape that's on around a portfolio. And oh, Mark, we both have a lot of stories what we bumped into when we started talking about this before, but I think you had some of the better ecosystem and the value of knowing your ecosystem stories. If you want to pick up and share a couple of those.
Uh, yeah, got to pick stories that won't take me too far down a rabbit hole. Uh, let's take an easy one. Um, the classic portfolio structures that I see as soon as I start to map mirror the org chart, right? And next episode we'll talk about BU portfolios or perhaps P&L portfolios. To be honest, even that's a level of sophistication above a lot of the enterprises that I first start to map. Because I look at the org chart and you know that fundamentally there'll be some level of the org chart which says if you're this senior, you're going to have a portfolio. And when you have that starting pattern, you generally get a giant rat's nest of intersections between the portfolios and local optimizations. And what you tend to find is the big strategic levers you're trying to pull don't get anywhere because they sit at a level that spans a bunch of these org chart portfolios, but there's nothing that's effectively dragging them together. So I had one which was exactly that. There were probably 20 portfolios within a division. They mirrored the org chart. Uh, the division had a very exciting strategy, very well articulated. They were struggling to make any progress whatsoever on it, despite very much passion from the sponsor and support from the board. And they had a divisional portfolio which really just existed as a governance body, right? Collect and compile the reports, make sure PPM's being adhered to. And we went through this exercise of going, well, what happens if we amplify the nature of the divisional portfolio and start to really work on the divisional portfolio providing the glue that starts to link the divisional strategy to what's happening within the local portfolios. And, Agro Me went, well, the local portfolios aren't really portfolios and we should just kill them, right? And then the me that had slightly more battle scars went, yeah, but you can't go and tell a whole bunch of execs that they don't really own a portfolio. And portfolio managers, they're not really portfolio managers. So it's really just a shifting, right? Looked at the whole and shifted the emphasis and started to put more meat into the divisional portfolio than just sitting in a purely governance. What about you?
Um, I've got plenty of stories there, but I think I might take this opportunity just to first celebrate the power of knowing the relationships with the other portfolios that I heard it. And I find that's often one of the biggest things that happens when you start to visualize kind of this contextual part. And then the other thing is recognizing the value of sharing. Well, I'm going to say progress, but keep in mind that I'm talking about like outcome progress here, not output progress. So progress against strategic outcomes, and being clear and upfront against around those things gives other portfolios really a heads up whether they've got some margin because of the work you're doing or whether they're going to have to like push and take up some slack because you're falling behind. And that's terrifying to admit as an executive. Either way, in some cases, because like I don't want to overpromise or underdeliver. um, but it helps the health of the ecosystem, and that's kind of the parts of the portfolio context that I'm interested in seeing and visualizing is the relationships between them and the implications of them over or underperforming and so on. And then kind of the third area we talked about was structure. Um, and this is a little bit of like, what do you own and not own? And a lot of, and how did you choose to implement your portfolio? Where are your value streams? If you have value streams, where are your suppliers? Are you just a wrapper around a joint venture? I've seen that one a couple times. But being very transparent and sharing that internal structure and visualizing it so everybody in and around the portfolio frankly understands the surface area and knows how to relate with the internals where appropriate, but also like where are the boundaries? What am I going to run into? Oh, this whole train is the service provider, not this one person. Okay, I'll talk to the official source or what have you. The implication of all of this is that when you start to visualize and you get good at visualizing these characteristics, like I said, it's not a recipe, but it's a healthy kind of one place to get started. Really fascinating questions start to come out, and that's where we start to see change. Um, Mark, you love asking these questions. You're the king of fascinating questions. This might make a good place for you to take over.
Look, I think the segue to asking an interesting question is having the data that tells you the questions that are interesting. So again, this kind of part of the puzzle of as you start to visualize is the visualizations should point you towards the interesting questions. So if I take a really easy one, and we'll stay in structure for a minute because that often leads to some very interesting questions. One of the pieces I obsess about the book of work as part of my early visualization,
Mhm.
and I want the whole book of work. I want the book of work that starts in whatever the enterprise PPM system is, because that tends to be what the CEO looks at. And I want to trace that all the way down to the story. Because generally, for most organizations, there will be a legacy book of work defined in their PPM and an agile book of work defined in Jira or Azure DevOps or something else. And they won't necessarily always meet, but you want to be able to understand how you can get them to meet. Um, but the other thing that you want to do is, and because I think what we want is maximize value, maximize the flow of value. The first question I want to ask is, what's my lowest level of value? Uh, because there's no point trying to optimize flow of something that's not a valuable thing. And so you look at whatever your hierarchy is what's the lowest level of value. Now, if you're in an amazing world, your lowest level of value, right? And I'm talking value to the customer or value to the P&L, right? It could be a user story. It's very rare I get to coach those places. They don't need me.
Mhm.
uh, if I'm doing great save, my lowest level of value is my features. But often my structure means that I'm not getting value from features because I need multiple arts, multiple value streams, all doing a piece of the work before it adds up to something interesting and valuable. And I find sometimes that, the lowest level where you can actually see something valuable is the epic, and then it gets broken into a bunch of non-valuable features. Um, but I'm looking for that, what's the lowest level of value in your world? And then how can I start to trace flow on that lowest level of value and see where the things that hurt flow are? And often those things that hurt flow are the way we're structured, the way we manage cross portfolio or cross internal pieces of the portfolio dependency management, uh, and start to ask a new thread of questions in terms of how can we get our pieces of valuable work to flow better, and what discussions do we need to begin and who needs to be at the table for those discussions to make it happen. Now, having said that, I picked a story which reversed hats because I'm usually the set based thinking obsessive guy, and you're normally the make the work flow better guy. So, since I started in make the work flow better, I might hand back to you for a set based thinking. What kind of questions do you like to see when you're thinking about the whole?
Oh wow. I'm gonna have to put on a completely different hat here for a second, but no, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's kind of the who, what, and why questions is what I tend to boil down to. The who ones are easy, like who's not at the table that should be. And often that starts to when you look at structure or you look at that book of work, and it's like, wait, I thought you were doing a big digital transformation right now. Where's all the digital work? Because this all looks like BU work. And it's like, oh, that's in a different portfolio. Like, oh, well, that's going to be really interesting. And you start to recognize there's a break between BU and channel. And I see this far too often. And those, um, one, you find your KPIs no longer make sense. There's conflicting KPIs, there's active situations where both sides can't win, which is horrible when you have two portfolios that only one gets to win. Um, and I'm not being sarcastic. It's like actually a really bad, dangerous situation for the enterprise. Um, but then you also start to ask those questions like, wow, somebody could. What if we added some extra people to the table? What if we got some advice from the BU from the channel and invited them to be part of this selection of investments and epics and let their voice be heard and start to tie things together at that level. Um, so I start to really just look at those questions. Where are the entanglements, or where should there be entanglements and aren't? And they the forms take a lot of different, like the questions take a lot of different forms. So it's hard to pick specifics in an abstract sense. You've got some specifics though. I think you've asked that got me thinking when we were prepping this.
So I I think there's a piece where, I mean, you and I are both wired to particular questions because we've been doing this, studying it, and obsessing about it for a very long time. Uh, but if you're not us, then there's a link back to go, what is something that's going to point me towards some interesting questions? And that's where I think if you go back to Zone to Win, you get some interesting prompts. For example, that channel example you just brought, right? The disconnection between the channel and the BU strategy. I would have been pointed towards that question instantly if I went, well, this is a performance zone portfolio. It should have the BU and the channel present at the table. Uh, there's another example, which is say, if I'm looking at a productivity portfolio, then I should be able to look at the KPIs and see productivity oriented KPIs, right? Productivity zone, I should be making the organization or the operation of the BUs cheaper cost to serve, faster speed to market, higher safety, right?
Mhm.
I should see KPIs that look like that because it's a productivity zone. And if I don't see KPIs like that for the portfolio, then what's the new question, right? So one of the values of tools, right? And last episode it was zone to win. Next episode we're going to be talking about different patterns of portfolios. Is that without having been as obsessive about it as Eric and I have been, these tools come along and go, here's a whole bunch of starter questions. Look at this. It
Mhm.
could be interesting what you see. Um, so I think that's the thread for me, right? But probably a really important piece of that thread, which is how do you create space to have the conversations that explore the answers or the implications of those questions? Because what I know is executives crave deep, meaningful conversation and they don't get to have a lot of it.
Yeah.
That every time you look at a diary of a senior executive, I don't know about you, but I just cry. Um, particularly, I went through a long exercise with a portfolio and a technology COO, and he was desperately keen to change the world and found it desperately hard to carve time out to really put his time into it, despite the fact that he loved every minute he carved out. And you look at his diary, and it is full of meetings that he has to go to in terms of accountability, responsibility, and due diligence that he very rarely gets any value out of.
Or provides much value into.
Yeah. Um, and, sometimes they get an occasional, start of year executive offsite. But so often leaders live in a world where they're stuck drowning in minutiae, and the only time they get for a deep discussion is, after business hours at 7 o'clock instead of having a home life. Uh, so if there's this thread that says, start where you are, visualize it, find some interesting questions, right? And the data that supports an exploration of those questions. And this is really what enables those deep, meaningful discussions between executives. What are some of your favorite tricks for helping to create the space for that to happen?
Oh, there's a couple different big categories of answers there. Like there's the individual tricks, and I think there's actually some value in discussing a couple of those. And then there's the kind of systems tricks. And I think a couple different individual tricks just to briefly cover them. One was my coaching of a CIO, and people around the company were like, "You get so much time with him. What's going on? Like, what do you talk about?" Half the time, it's like sometimes his dog, sometimes just a chance to unwind and vent slightly after the previous meeting, so that we can spend 10 minutes deep diving on a topic instead of 30 minutes blowing off steam. And it's fascinating some of those dynamics. And then the other one is like I knew one exec. She always had one or two um, explodable meetings in her calendar every day. They were there to protect the space, and they would inevitably be the ones right after what were meant to be the most likely to be the challenging ones, because several of those I was explicitly requested come hang out in the room next door. Just be there. I'm not sure if I'm going to need to join you or not, but don't, if you don't mind, just work in that room next door. And sure enough, about one time in three that happened, it was like, okay, we really need to talk. I need space. I need somebody that's outside that I can just get some space to process what just happened, instead of just going to the next meeting, the next meeting, and the next meeting. And by the to your point, by 7 o'clock, it's all just kind of receded. It's all a little hazy by then. So the individual stuff's kind of cool. Um, the big stuff, the systemic stuff, that's the fun ones for me. Um, and I think it starts with clean up, like more than anything, tidy your room a little bit. I think you start there too, don't you, Mark? Like
Oh, absolutely.
generally,
Yeah.
yeah. So what's that look like to you?
Uh, Remove noise, right? Find things that create noise and remove them. And generally, even before that, is how do I create space to actually work on removing noise? Right? Because if you think about the people that are really beginning this journey, it's not a coach, right? And generally not an executive. We just talked about how time poor they are and the fact we want to make some time for them. We're talking about a portfolio team or a PMO team. And I've never met a PMO team or a portfolio team that had a lot of time on their hands, right? They
I get worried when they do.
that they're forever meeting the next deadline for something or chasing and nagging for something they need in order to meet the next deadline. Uh, and so, if you really want to work on changing the system, well, these are the people who are going to change the system in terms of taking out some noise. But how do you help them to actually have the space to start to do that? And my actual first thread is where is there waste and duplication? And what can we do to reduce the waste and duplication? And that starts to buy some time in the day. And here's a really easy example. If, let's say, your members of the portfolio are recording their work in Jira and they, like many organizations, have a complete mess in Jira, and all of your reporting consists of asking somebody to compile a report for you and submit it to you that you then can't trace back to what's in Jira, and you then have to manually transition that report, right? And let's say, for example, you might be a PowerPoint factory who runs a series of PowerPoint factories. Can I chase automating some of my reporting? Now, there might be some implications there around cleaning up standards of consistency in Jira or changing some of the format of the reports to get to automation. But anywhere there's double handling of data, and really what we're talking about here is double handling of data, there's an opportunity to reduce waste, right? Classic lean hat. And then we buy an awful lot of time. So, that's probably my first starting thread is how do I buy time for the portfolio team and the PMO? Find everywhere that they are stuck in a land of wastefulness and go, how do we reduce the amount of waste there to buy you time to go and chase some more interesting things, which are going to actually start to shift the game in terms of the executive and leadership discussions. What about you?
Some of the similar, like I love to look for write only reports and see what happens if you don't write them for a little while.
Yeah.
Highlight this benefit that what we're getting ready to try to go do and ask some executives, do you mind if the three of you actually get the same report instead of us making a custom one for each of you now? Save a couple hours a week. Um, one exec, because they were going to their team asking this, the team said, well, we could just give you the data dump instead of putting it in a deck. I was like, yeah, I can read a data dump. It's already pretty dang clear. I know what to look for. And they just saved 2 hours a week right there. And it's a lot of these little things. And it doesn't sound like an hour here, an hour there. Doesn't sound huge, but if you look at it against the scheme of a couple thousand hours a year per person is what you have available, saving 10, 20 hours starts to add up to meaningful numbers. And the trick is not to fill that with new work. It's to reinvest it into further cleanup for a while
Yeah.
and then start to buy some space individually and then collectively. And then you can start to tackle some of the bigger, funner stuff, such as, you want to segue here?
Oh, absolutely. Segue, right? So the bigger, funner stuff at the end of the day is, if let's imagine you've bought space, you've taken some noise out. How do you start to bring different data into the leadership discussions that actually supports the new discussion, right? And that's going to begin with, what's the agenda, right? Whatever you do, don't add new meetings and workshops. You're dealing with a crew
That's a
of
tough one.
leaders who drown in meetings and workshops. And it's a classic beginner mistake I've seen a lot of people make, is to go, oh, we've got this thing called a portfolio sync, or uh, you know, some other buzzword, and we're just going to add it. And oh, by the way, that means we need a monthly slot in 20 leaders' diaries. Um, have fun. No, go
Next fiscal year.
go go look at the times they already gather and the agendas they already have, and go, how can I create space in an existing forum, and what data is going to create an interesting discussion with that space.
And get creative on those too. Like one of the more creative is a chief product officer gave us once a month a slot in their staff meeting, which, oh, by the way, happened to have all the executives that we needed to have this conversation. We just added three or four people. They were so excited to get added to the CPO staff meeting. It was like fascinating watching this dynamic. And I've seen three or four variations of that with staff meetings.
So, so if that's kind of trick number one, then I think trick number two is, change requires credibility, right?
Yeah.
All these questions that pop up are going to require a leader or a group of leaders to spend some of their personal credibility,
Yep.
to go somewhat out on a limb and go, we're going to do something differently. And credibility is like a bank. And
I
that's
mean,
probably
there's
the
a
other.
term.
Sorry?
There's a reason why it's called political capital in a lot of
Yeah,
companies.
absolutely. So that's the other thing that influences me when I'm starting down this journey is, how can the early things we do with the portfolio generate political capital for the executives who are accountable for that portfolio to be able to point to runs on the board when they start to suggest bigger changes.
So if I put that kind of thread back together for a second, the arc we've kind of talked about is create the visualizations that are going to be useful, do some cleanup work to create the space for people to think a little more deeply, and then make sure you don't waste their time so that you can put some wins on the board. That sounds simple. We just made a recipe. Didn't It's not that easy.
if only it were that easy. Uh, but if you put a summary cap on that, the summary cap is don't start with the change. Right? It's that thing of don't rush to solution, and it's probably the biggest beginner mistake I see so many people make with lean portfolio management. You go, here's the flip.
I think that's the thread that is really what I'm talking about when I say don't do agile for agile's sake. It start by understanding the problems you're facing, and that is a deep understanding of the context you're, and then start to make that less painful to create the space to solve bigger problems. Then you'll suddenly realize you're using a lot of agile, a lot of lean.
Which is probably the last piece as we segue away into a wrap for the episode. We talked way back in episode one, we talked about the idea that really when you get to a portfolio level, you're not really talking about agile very much, you're talking about lean. But it doesn't mean that your portfolio teams can't use agile themselves. This is my closing story, it just reminded me. I was working with an organization back in the life before COVID,
Hmm.
and their enterprise PMO came to me and said, look, more and more safe is happening. They had by this stage a bunch of arts that were generating a lot of success. And they said it's obvious safe is the future for us. And we need to understand it if we're going to be able to support and evolve you know, the entire enterprise down that path. So we want to run our EPMO as a train. And it was a big enough EPMO to actually make a train out of, right? 60 or 70 people. Uh, and I went, my goodness, EPMO as a train, that's going to be bizarre. But what a great idea. Like, I love the leadership of we've got to learn it before we can help others do it, right? And internalize it. So they went down the path, and it's fair to say that they look like a lot of arts do. Uh, but there was a truth that said when they planned a PI, the planning of the PI was here's all the stuff we have to do because it's recurring and regular. And here's the stuff we want to change. And so they would kind of fill up all of their pre-allocated capacity of their normal day jobs, and then they would go, these are the features we're going to introduce this PI that are going to shift the way things work. And what they found, PI after PI, was that they never actually got to act on their improvement features because they got drowned in their operational stuff. But it created a new conversation for them. And they said, look, we're never going to get to change the world until we change how much of our time is consumed by today's day to day. And they started to ask new questions. The first question they said was, well, we look at all these standard processes we do and we go, what's the value proposition? And the first one they looked at was that they had an audit process where they audited project plans. And there was a sampling rate and it consumed a ridiculous amount of time. And they looked and they said, well, how much value do we actually get out of those audits? We certainly have a regulatory obligation around auditing project plans, but we very rarely find anything in the audits. And boy, it consumes a lot of our time and it consumes a lot of people's times complying with those audits. So, what happens if we change the sampling rate to only sample 20% instead of the 100% we do at the moment? And the answer was yes, that would still feel responsible, it would still satisfy our duties, and look at all the time it buys. Um, and it's a great example of right what happens when you take some agile constructs, you put them in a PMO, and you start to play with it at the portfolio level. You ask yourself really interesting questions about how you can make space for change. So,
Fascinating. That probably just on the surface probably saved a couple $1 million a year inside that group and probably an equal amount outside the group.
yeah,
Wow.
easily. So, if we wrap this episode, right, and going back to where we started, it was we've been talking a lot about understand the ecosystem, understand the ecosystem a portfolio is part of, understand what's inside the portfolio, and start to ask yourself new questions. And those new questions might relate to clarity of strategy, effectiveness and efficiency of governance and operations. And Eric did such a beautiful wrap. I'm not going to try and do it again around the little thread of visualize it as step one, and then start to follow through on the things that you see when you visualize it. But we're going to zoom back out next episode. So there's a thread, and it came up a couple of times in this episode of going, how do you know which questions to start asking? Well, Zone to Win can help. It's a performance zone portfolio, it's a productivity zone portfolio. Uh, some of the other tools like flow metrics can also give you questions to ask. But Eric was part of actually, I was very jealous of the amount of research he got to do when he did it. He was part of the team that rebuilt the Safe portfolio article late last year. Um, and as part of that journey, they found a set of patterns for portfolios, and they wound up deciding that it wasn't quite formal enough to call them patterns when they published them. They were called examples. But they add another huge set of tools in terms of starting to really contextualize a portfolio in the ecosystem and another layer of questions you might ask. So that's where we're going to head next episode. And we've gone a little bit longer this one because we couldn't contain ourselves from getting into a bit of storyland. But I hope you enjoyed, and we look forward to seeing you for episode 5 as we dig into portfolio examples.